My name is Richard Bernal. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs here at the University of the West Indies. This evening it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you here to the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies here in Kingston, Jamaica. I would normally start my salutations by recognizing the Vice Chancellor, who unfortunately cannot be with us, sends his apologies. He had to travel this afternoon. I'd like to recognize the former Governor General, Sir Kenneth Hall and Lady Hall, members of the Diplomatic Corps, senior members of the university, principals, pro-vice chancellors, deans, registrars, bursars, etc. I had to mention the bursar, I know she pays our salaries. Faculty, staff, students, our special guest of honor, Professor Orlando Patterson, media, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies. Welcome to this evening's public lecture by Professor Orlando Patterson. I want to extend a very special welcome to all who are joining us by watching UWI TV, which is live streaming all over the world. Therefore, this is not a local event, but a global event. No surprise, I deal with global affairs. So, welcome, and just a few things I need to get out of the way so we can have uninterrupted flow. I want to recognize the sponsors who made this event possible. They are JMMB, Chase, and the JMMB Foundation. Special word of thanks to UWI TV, to Marcia, Rhonda, Janet, Jamani. Okay, commercials out of the way. We can now proceed. I'm going to ask Professor Michael Barnett. Well, I just promoted him. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology. He's going to start off our program, and the reason I'm allowing him to start the program is that he initiated the public lecture. He was the person who thought of bringing Professor Patterson here, and along with Ian Randall and Ian Randall Publishers, who have made the book affordable for us people in the developing world. So, Dr. Barnett, if you are here, this is the time for you to appear. Well, you know, one of the functions of a chairman is that he must be able to filibuster if there are any persons missing from the program. So, I am going to then move on to introduce our guest speaker, and when Dr. Barnett appears, he will no doubt add his own words of wisdom. But we can excuse him. He has been chief cook and head bottle washer. I'm sure he's arranging some detail of the program which has escaped us. So let me turn to the introduction then. This evening's speaker is Professor Orlando Patterson. He was born in Westmoreland, raised in Clarendon, and when he became there are always a few people from deep rural. Anyway, when he reached an intelligent age, he moved to Kingston. And what I'm about to say may contradict that. He went to Kingston College. But then again, sanity and good sense prevailed, because when he left Kingston College, he came to the hallowed halls of the University of the West Indies. Having done well there, he went on to do his PhD in sociology at the London School of Economics. And he immediately returned to become a lecturer in the sociology department at the University of West Indies at the Mona campus. His education in London was not confined to studying books and writing dissertations. He was part of a group of young Caribbean scholars who were set to move us beyond independence to development and so on. And that, shall I say, reasoning, or to borrow a term from Walter Rodney, grounding with his brothers in London, has formed some lasting bonds, some of which he has been able to refresh here since he arrived. When he came to Mona, he came into a sort of Caribbean intellectual vortex because some really brilliant people, several brilliant people arrived at the same time. And you will note from these names, George Beckford, Norman Gervin, C.Y. Thomas, Trevor Monroe, Havelock Brewster, Alistair McIntyre, Walter Rodney, Rex Nettleford, Edward Brathwaite, Roy Auger, Douglas Hall, Elsa Govire, Edward Green, Barish Evans, Eddie Baugh, and there are probably some others that I've omitted. His early writings were not in formal sociology. He started out as a novelist. His first published work, Children of Sisyphus, 1965, dealt with Lower Kingston and the people who were trying to eke out a living there. And subsequently, an absence of ruins, and then Died a Long Day, for which he has been rightly recognized with the Gold Musgrave Medal for Literature. But his life's work has really been in sociology. And I see 4 themes that have dominated his work, and I will finish this and then let Dr. Barnett give his remarks. Since I'm halfway running up to the wicket, I may as well deliver rather than bowl a no ball. 4 themes have emerged in his work. One is slavery. Major works include A Sociology of Slavery, 1967, an analysis of Negro slave society in Jamaica, and Slavery and Social Death, which was published in 1982. This last work poses the paradox of the coexistence of freedom and slavery at the same time. And that paradox has continued to echo in the rest of his work. His next great theme, quite naturally, having studied slavery, which is the ultimate form of unfreedom, naturally he moved on to tackle freedom. And he examined freedom in ancient and modern societies. And that first volume of work won the National Book Award. His third basic theme has been the predicament of the African American. And that is natural. If you live in a country for so many years, it's natural for you to try and understand the environment in which you live. But in a way, it was a continuation of the work, because the paradox for African Americans is the same one of his earlier works, which is unfreedom, persistent poverty, in the face of freedom, which is plenty. And therefore, it's a continuation of studying that. Indeed, it's also a continuation because the work recognizes that what has constrained African Americans, especially young people, is not just the current situation, but it is the legacy of history. So it's a continuation of that leitmotif that runs through his work. The black people that Professor Patterson is most concerned about are those of the Caribbean, and in particular his native Jamaica. Throughout his career, this underlying and recurring preoccupation has run through his work. So we shouldn't see the current book about Jamaica as a stage. It's been in gestation all through his work, and it draws on all his work. He has been not just enjoying the pleasures of exile, but reflection from a distance is often sharpened, and this he has brought to bear on this book. But he has never abandoned the Caribbean because he is a frequent visitor to Jamaica, and he was an advisor to the Manley government in the 1970s. Indeed, he has a chapter, final chapter, on Manley. And ironically, somebody whispered to me, "It's the best chapter." I won't dispute that. But, so, drawing on all of this, he has put together a series of essays into a book, The Confounding Island, Jamaica, the Post-Colonial Predicament. Again, he's trying to answer paradoxes, such as, why is Jamaica so democratic but so violent? This is, again, freedom versus unfreedom. He looks at, why are Jamaicans the fastest runners in the world? Again, that's an intriguing question. And he also looks at the combative individualism of Jamaicans. Both are good quality. It brings resilience, survival, innovation, but also a downside, the violence, the social destruction. So, I was going to close by saying, and now I give you Professor Orlando Patterson, but now I'm going to give you Dr. Michael Barnett.
Yes, greetings and welcome everybody. I'm going to assume that Ambassador Bernal has dispensed with the formalities, so I'm not going to be that formal at this point in time. But just to say, I'm pleased to see everybody is here to hear from our esteemed academic and intellectual Professor Orlando Patterson. And I have the pleasure of being the person in the department who reached out to him during the summer months of this year about the possibility of him coming to address us about his recent work and his studies. Because as a sociologist, I have, made reference to much of his work. And what strikes me about Orlando Patterson is that whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he always has a very sharp opinion about certain things. So it's hard really to navigate the realm of sociology without confronting, some of his ideas. And that's a lot to be said, because one of the things as academics and intellectuals is we don't want to be relevant. I think that's the worst fate for any academic, is to be totally irrelevant. So, it's inspiration for us here. And also, he's a son of the soil of Jamaica. And it's good to welcome home. And he does consider Jamaica still his home, although he's been away for several years. To welcome home a son of the soil, And I see him as really also a son of Huey as well, because I don't know if Ambassador Bernal told you, but he was the first graduating class from social sciences. 1962, he was that class that graduated. So he represents the birth of our social science faculty in many ways. He was an economics major in his undergraduate degree before he did sociology as his PhD. So not only that, but when you read his work, you think this man is a historian, because trust me, his historiography is very deep and detailed. And I see myself, although not formally, but as a historical sociologist, because one of my areas is African diaspora studies, the study of how the diaspora came to be. And obviously we have to look at the transatlantic slave trade, and he goes into that with great rigor and detail. as much as any historian does. And also as somebody who happens to be on the National Council of Reparations here in Jamaica, you know, his work is a good reference, resource, looking at the misery of slavery, the abject dejection, because these are the issues that we are concerned about in pushing for reparations, because our ancestors, many of our ancestors anyway, did suffer incredibly miserable life, and we shouldn't just ignore that. We shouldn't sweep it under the carpet. So his work even acts as a reference for us in the Council of Reparations here in Jamaica as we confront England about its inhumane treatment of our ancestors. And there shouldn't be any shame in doing that. One of the things I have to say, just as I go, because probably it's fortunate for you, but Ambassador Bernal went through most of what I wanted to say about his work and his books and so forth. So the only thing I'm going to talk about, one of his works, is The Children of Sisyphus, the novel, because this novel speaks to the condition of Rastafari in the early 60s. And so it speaks as a sort of ethnography, if you like, on Rastafari. And I should just let people know that one of my areas of concentration is on Rastafari. And I would say that I am both a Rastafari scholar as well as student and teacher, all encompassed. But one of the things about the condition of Rastafari in Jamaica that we should bear in mind is they are always marginalized, on the periphery, the dejected. And his book speaks to the misery, the rancor of the conditions they lived in. And if nothing else, you know, I would say it's useful reading because, and I'm giving forewarning to some people, but there is on the table an internal reparations lawsuit for the Bako wall being bulldozed, because even though it was a miserable living conditions for the Rastafari were there, it was a place they called home. So for the sake of Tivoli Gardens, they lost their homes. They were bulldozed. They got no compensation at all. So there's some of us who think it quite rightfully they should get compensation despite the miserable conditions they were living under. They still had possessions. They deserved to get some kind of compensation. And there are still Rastafari alive today who suffer the indignation of having their belongings destroyed and their houses bulldozed. So that book actually serves a reference for that. So I give thanks, Professor Patterson. And without further ado, let's welcome back Ambassador Bernal to introduce Professor Patterson here. And thank you as well to my colleagues in the Sociology, Department of Sociology, Psychology and Social Work for the support for those who supported the event. Thank you.
I'm not going to introduce Professor Patterson again. Orlando Patterson is Professor of Sociology at Harvard University, and next year he becomes the longest serving professor at Harvard. We're happy to and the most important thing on his bio is that he's an alum of the University of the West Indies. And I see so many alum here present. Happy to have you here, Professor.
Thank you, thank you. Well, my fellow Jamaicans certainly know how to welcome one back home, right? This is wonderful. Distinguished guests, the Governor General, this gracious lady, ladies and gentlemen. So 50 years ago, when I went on leave from the Department of Sociology to Harvard, and while there, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. But let me make this clear to the members of the Sociology Department who arranged this visit. I hope you're still holding my position for me, because I consider myself still on leave. As we say in Jamaica, soon come. or rather, in my case, soon come back. I know this distinctive saying of Jamaicans drives others from the Caribbean and the world crazy. We not only prevaricate, we indulge in it. We're sometimes proud of it. We even write books on it. There are at least 2 books with the title Soon Come. And however, before those of you who are not Jamaicans begin to condemn us for our outrageous prevarication, don't forget that we're also the fastest people in the world. And that, in a nutshell, is the gist of the question I want to discuss this evening. How can a culture of prevarication also with the fastest people? And that's not where the paradox ends. In fact, it's just the beginning. There are really few places on earth more confounding and paradoxical than this little island of ours. A little island barely the size of Connecticut. It has a larger global profile than countries many, many times its size. It's at times celebrated for its spectacular, and they are spectacular, performances of its stars and its, shall I get this working, Mr. Technician? Okay, we'll wait for that to come out. But as you know, condemned here and abroad for the depravity of its gangsters and racketeers and failures of its economy until recently. All too aware, Jamaicans selectively proud of this record. As you know, our favorite saying is, "We little but we talawa," which I've had to translate to my American colleagues. We're small, but we're mighty. In global comparisons, Jamaica has an unnerving way of coming out among the best and the worst in the world. We sort of are global in our performance. And this graph I have here summarizes in many respects. Some of the arrows are based on international assessment, Transparency International and so on, GDP. Some are more stylized, my assessment of where we are, on both the good side and on the bad side. And as you can see, it's quite an amazing graph. We, as you know, love to claim that we have the greatest number of churches in the world. That's not quite true, even per square miles. I mean, Bermuda and Malta beats us to that. But it is true that we have a lot of churches. And there's no doubt that we are a God-fearing people. We are in fear of God. We're even more in fear of the devil. Judging from the, hell and brimstone nature of the sermons. And I spent some time studying Jamaican religion way back in the 60s, not just the Rastafarian group. At a time, in a period when, in fact, as an undergraduate, I could wander around West Kingston, going to the Pocomania churches, and without fear of losing limb or life. Or Rastafarians, one of the great creations. I mean, so we've, among all the things we've done, we've actually created a religion. Isn't that incredible? Which has global reach. A few years ago, I visited Japan and almost fell off my chair, just sitting, having a drink and seeing a group of Japanese Rastafarians walking in. They're everywhere. It is a genuine religion, and it is a genuine creation. But in spite of this religiosity, which I have on the right-hand side of my graph there, and our philosophy of peace and love, we are, of course, one of the most violent and reckless, downright sinful nations. We once actually had the unfortunate, unenviable distinction of having the highest homicide rate. I have something to say about that. And we're still among the top 10. In fact, we've just worsened our status. We are now among the top 5. Yardis, posse gangsters, spreading terror, even in America. In fact, in the 80s, hardened criminal gangs were terrified of the Jamaican gangs. And so it's, our national music, is, reggae, dancehall, globally influential. Our national hero, Bob Marley, arguably one of the world's most recognizable voices. Again, traveling around the world, there's no part of the world he can go in which people aren't aware of Jamaican music. This is quite incredible. There are many parts of the world you can go in which people, have never heard of Bach or, the music of other cultures. Nonetheless, even where we are extraordinarily productive and preach a philosophy of love, we also have the latest versions of dancehall, which celebrates violence, Afro-Jamaican ragamuffin thuggery, homophobia, and sexism to a degree that several of its best singers have been banned from America and Britain. What's going on in this little country? It's really quite extraordinary. Our track athletes, are among the best, are the best. Even when we have no chances of winning, we turn up to steal the show, as our bobsleigh team did in Canada, Winter Olympics. We're a very boasty people, very boasty. I have an interesting story to tell you about the American visitor, a farmer from Texas who got bored. The beaches, went up to the St. Hans Mountains and saw a proud Jamaican farmer leaning on his old beaten up jalopy car. And had seen better days. So the American said, "Oh, you're a farmer?" He said, "Yes, I'm a big farmer. I've got 4 acres." And the Texan said, "Where I come from, I have a farm. I can get in my car and drive all afternoon, and I'm still in my car." And the Jamaican said, "My God, what a coincidence. I have a car just like that." Boasty, right? But this paradox exists in other areas too. You have here on the left-hand side the institutional lessons, again, until recently. We haven't done so well in macroeconomic development, but it's quite extraordinary. The World Bank, which has expended enormous effort, unsuccessfully until recently, helping to turn this economy around. To them, there's one inexplicable paradox, which they all scratch their head over, especially during the 90s, when throughout the decades and continuing into the 21st century, the growth rate, as you know, stalled. In fact, was negative sometimes. But lo and behold, the poverty rate kept going down, which the World Bank could never figure out. It defies all economic logic. And as the World Bank reported in one of its many reports, and I quote them, "Jamaican economic history is a story of paradox and potential." That's a good description of this wondrous little island. And equally perplexing, of course, is the fact that after decades of economic stagnation, the island has suddenly come to life under a new generation of leaders. But defying logic seems to be a perverse propensity of our island. And it is no accident that the term paradox appears so often in experts' and laymen's attempt to understand the place. Take another example, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on, our demographic history. The fact that during the first half of the 20th century, when conditions were really very bad in Jamaica, nonetheless, the island saw witness a demographic revolution in which we moved from a medieval level life expectancy of about 34 years to the threshold which demographers define as moving into a modern phase of 70 years. Now, the interesting thing is a story you may not know. The interesting thing about that transition is that there's what demographers call the health transition. How long it took countries, and all countries for millennia were at that low level, how long it took them to move from that medieval level or threshold to our point, to the threshold of 70 years of age, which people see as it. It took Western Europe on average something like 130 years to make that transition. They started somewhere in the late 18th, early 19th century, Denmark being the fastest, Britain about 120 years. It took Jamaica 40 years to do it. It's really an incredible feat. And there are many such feats in Jamaican history which you may not know about, but which as someone who has probed the history in great detail, I happen to know, which confounds me. And one would have thought that with so much violence, such poor economic performance, so many head-scratching paradoxes, Jamaica would be an unhappy bunch of people. Not a chance. In the first UN World Happiness Report of 2012, Jamaica ranked among the happiest quarter of 156 countries measured. More puzzlingly, the British people felt this doesn't make sense and arbitrarily pushed Jamaica down, but then just recently, the British Happy Planet Index did another survey. Jamaicans were among the happiest people. They ranked 11 out of 180 countries. You go figure. One columnist in Jamaica, one of our leading newspapers, The Observer, asked if Jamaicans are happy for the wrong reasons. He said, could a mentally disturbed man be more happy than a normally adjusted person, asked Mark Vignall. What is certainly clear is that Jamaicans imagine themselves to be a laid-back people. The expression, Jamaica no problem, which vies with the utterances of Donald Trump for self-deluding falsehoods, has become a national motto. Well, you know, the fact that Jamaica is among the top marijuana-consuming countries in the world may have something to do with this self-delusion. And we are, I said the top 10. I was surprised. I thought we were the top 5. Whatever the explanation, a positive attitude may well be best for a country with so many problems and so many perplexing contradictions. As a Jamaican and a historical sociologist, I've pondered Jamaica's problems for most of my adult life. And my first work, which is kindly mentioned, explored one major source of our problems, that for nearly 2/3 of the 473 years since its European discovery by Columbus, 1494, Jamaica was a slave society. All the more compelling a factor, given that 183 years of British plantation slavery, and I want to emphasize this point, may possibly have been the most brutal in the gruesome annals of world slavery. That's another first. See, people often say, well, what about other countries suffered slavery? But there's slavery and there's slavery. Even within the Caribbean, there are extraordinary differences, and I'll get to that in speaking briefly about Barbados. Even within the Caribbean, the British spared no quarter in their extreme exploitation of the island and their willingness to import Africans as slaves to work on the sugar plantations, the coffee farms, and the cattle pens. I came from one such cattle pen. May Pen comes from, the pens were sort of the areas of pastures where cattle is raised. For over a century, and here's another first, by the way, Jamaica was the most lucrative colony in the British Empire. The most lucrative colony in the British Empire. To quote a contemporary, a constant mine whence Britain draws prodigious riches, unquote. Its trade, this little island with Britain, outstripped that of all the North American colonies put together. It was also, and this is based on recent excellent work by several economic historians, including an economist colleague of mine at Harvard, to quote the recent report by Bernard Patterson Williamson, the most unequal place on the planet, far more so than the US South. In fact, the estimate was that the inequality was 20 times greater than the inequality between masters and slaves in the US South. So you see what I mean when I say this is not just in these areas that Jamaica is unusual, globally unusual. It is globally unusual in the horror of its slavery. Let me just cite another fact. More slaves, as I said, were brought here in Jamaica than to all of North America. Imagine that. Just think about that for a minute. Than all the southern colonies, slave colonies, to this little island. This may strike you as stunning. What happened to them? They died. They were worked to death. And that's why I refer to what happened as a slow motion genocide. It was, in fact, the second great genocide that took place in the island. The first great genocide, of course, was the genocide of the Tainos, who were all massacred by the Spanish, killed and by diseases which the Spanish brought within 30 years. The entire indigenous population was wiped out. But this slow motion genocide, I wanted to think of that term because it was genocide. In contrast, say, with the United States, the slavery was over there, but by 1700, by 1710, the US slave population was reproducing. Jamaican slave population never reproduced. Of course, the Jamaicans didn't take it lying down. Jamaica is unique in another respect. It had the largest number of slave revolts than any other slave society. Major slave revolts. Slave revolts from the very beginning, 1655, right through, which I've written on by one of my early works, the First Maroon Wars, which went on until 1740, when something extraordinary happened. Now, you've heard of Haiti being described as the first successful slave revolt. Actually, that's not quite accurate. And this is not to take away from the glory of the Haitian slave revolt. The first successful slave revolt took place were the so-called First Maroon Wars. In 1650, in fact, the British came very close to abandoning the island. And the British sued for peace. The mighty British army sued for peace. And came to terms, signed a treaty with what became later the Maroons, giving them a state within a state status. This has never happened in any slave society, ancient, medieval, or modern. Again, our strange little island. It's just global in that respect. But the long history of resistance continued right through. And the last great slave revolt, of course, the Baptist War of Daddy Sharp, was critical in the abolition of slavery, because as the British dithered about slavery, whether they should pass the act or not, in a way the Jamaicans took matters in their own hands and staged an island-wide revolt, 1832, and the British then said enough. That made up their minds real fast. And so again, Jamaica was a crucial fact. It is an extraordinary history. When I'm reciting it, not just for the sake of pointing out what is unusual, but because of its implications for what happened. That long history of near genocide and resistance was bound to have an effect on people. And the cantankerous nature, the combative individualism of the Jamaicans, rooted in this long history of extreme, severe colonialism and extreme resistance, like no other country in the modern world or in the history of the world. This is worth bearing in mind as a historian. I then wondered what effect all of this had and how it explains our present plight, or economic plight, or violence, both the good things and the bad things in that stylized graph. And the first essay of my work, and the longest one, in many respects I think the most important, tackles the problem of why, this problem, if you like, why we haven't succeeded more. But I want to say something before going on, that one of the interesting things about Jamaica and why it's worth studying, and why, in fact, scholars from all over the world study Jamaica, is that it's fascinating not only in itself, but because it poses problems both in its negative side and in the positive side that has broader and deeper significance for the entire post-colonial and developing world. Studying Jamaica, you come to understand the world, the developing world, in a way in which you don't looking at most other societies. So, in the first essay, I attempt to explain Jamaica's poor macroeconomic performance since independence. And I did so through a close comparison of one of its sister islands, Barbados. I think Barbadians are going to love this book, although for the wrong reason. If there's any Barbadians. Which has done so much better since independence. It's having some problems now, but all countries have problems. America had a huge problem, and in fact, as a result of the recession in 2008 and so on. But the Barbadian trajectory has been one of extraordinary success, measured not just in terms of GDP, but it's the overall quality of life, assessed in various ways, such as the Human Development Index, in which it ranks more among the advanced countries, while Jamaica stagnated. And so that comparison, I'm a comparative sociologist as well as a historical one, allows us to resolve one of the most vexing problems today in the study of economic development, that of the relative significance of institutions and good policies in explaining development. There's a huge debate going on right now on this subject. And there are good reasons, by the way, that one of the people who blurbed this book is perhaps the leading economist in the study of institution, Daron Acemoglu of MIT, who's a winner of the Clark Prize, which is a prize given by the economics profession to the person they consider the smartest among them under 40. So, well, Acemoglu loved the book because it takes the institutionalist position, but there is a real tension going on in Washington and elsewhere as to which is more important. Good institutions or good policies? Everybody agrees you need good policies, but the question which precedes which. For a long time, the view is that good policies matter, and the institutions will take care of themselves. That's what led development thinking for the entire post-war period. And I want to, oops, I seem to have missed something here. Okay, well, what I wanted to, let's go back here. A very eminent West Indian economist, Henry, along with a colleague Miller, has taken strongly to the policies side. For him, good policies, especially the Washington Consensus, is what matters. The institutions will take care of themselves. And that's a standard view among most economists who have advised this country for most of its post-independence history. And it's a sort of model of the Henry and Miller thesis. Now, it's a rather ingenious thesis because they use this comparison to good effect. Their basic argument is, look, Jamaica and Barbados are very similar. Same history of slavery, same British colonialism, similar post-colonial history. They became independent about the same time. They didn't mention it, but almost all their best scholars are trained at the University of the West Indies. And fast forward from independence, a half a century, and you get a totally different picture. Barbados' per capita income is well over twice that of Jamaica. In fact, before it got into its recent economic difficulties, it was 3 times that of Jamaica. But more important, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just GDP per capita, which I don't particularly favor as an index, but in the general level of life in Barbados. So, argued Henry and Miller, it follows that it could not be institutions. They are the same institutions, ergo it must have been better policies. The Washington Consensus, the IMF gospel. And the argument has been very persuasive, and many people have seen that as a nail in the coffin, as he claims, of the institutional approach. Aha, we got you, by this interesting comparison. Well, I came with the view not so fast. And my basic, I don't have the time to get into the details here, but my basic argument is that what is critical is not so much the institutions, but how well you play the institution game. Institutions often defined, especially by the Nobel economists who basically started the whole institutional approach, as the rules of the game, basically. But as I said, you can know the rules, but you may not know how to play it. You know, I know the rules of cricket. I don't play it very well. My off break always gets knocked to the boundaries. And so that's critical. The question then is, and what I've concluded is that Barbados is just far more competent in the way in which it executed and played the institutions that it inherited. Why is that? See, so my argument then is that you need a more sophisticated approach in which institutional competence becomes important, and governance, good governance, political will, and with the right institutions and the right competence. Core competencies is what determines how effectively you apply the policies. And note I have in this model appropriate policies, not good policies, because they, again, departing from the IMF gospel that there's a good set of policies defined by the Washington Consensus, that ain't so. And an increasing number of economists are rejecting that. There are many ways of skinning the development cat. As the East Asian countries show, as China shows, in fact, God forbid. I mean, when I was an economist, if someone had told me or anyone that China would have a major free market economy, I'd say, you're crazy. But, you know, they found a different way of skinning that cat. So policies, not good policies as defined by Washington, the so-called Washington Consensus, but appropriate policies lead to development. That's the argument. To understand, then, why Barbados had these much better, the greater competence, you had to go into the history. And that's what I did in the first chapter. And it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating story of the relationship between a quite ruthless, but nonetheless very efficient elite, which is just as racist as the Jamaican elite, but which did not hesitate to use and incorporate in this institution building Black Barbadians. That in a nutshell is the story. In stark contrast with Jamaica, where there's a massive process of exclusion throughout. And this is where you begin to see the details and differences in the islands, and how Jamaica is in fact unique. It was an extreme case of extraction from the island. Absenteeism, little commitment to the island. The goal of people who came here was to make as much money, to extract as much wealth, and send it back to England. Many of the great houses and lower levels of the aristocracy based on Jamaican money, as opposed to Barbados, which from very early had a strong sense of local nationalism, and a lot of the wealth stayed in Barbados. And so I multiply the examples over and over. The Barbadian elite, again, in spite of the fact that they consider themselves superior nonetheless, did a lot of extraordinary things. I'll just give you one example. Again, a very big difference in our history. After slavery, the Barbadian elite decided that the low-class whites, who constituted a very large one, much larger than Jamaica, constituted almost a half of the population, were not up to scratch. And instead of using them to police the newly formed police force, which is being done everywhere, and what they did was almost inconceivable in American terms, they fired the entire white low class, claiming they're a degenerate lot, good for nothing, and brought in blacks. And you see this again and again in the educational system and so on. So I won't go into more details on this because I want you to read a book, but there are many examples like this, the upshot of which is Barbadians acquired institutional core competencies in running their institution, in playing the institutional game. Jamaica was the extreme case of exclusion. Even if you look at the Jamaican police force, as late as when I was growing up, most of the officers were British. By the end of the colonial period, the superintendents and so on are all Black Barbadians and so on. So my conclusion then is institutions. This is the general conclusion from this specific case. Institutions do matter. It precedes policies, but the acquisition of core competencies is what determines how the game is played. And Jamaica's challenge is not that it does not have the right institutions. We do. But in many areas, though not all, these are our successes, it has what has been called an implementation deficit by one organization, the German organization, which recently analyzed the island. A lack of core competencies essential for the efficient management of a successful modern economy. Okay, the next essay of the work looks at another really extraordinary problem and puzzle in Jamaica. Why are we so damn violent? Why? Just look at the newspapers today, for Christ's sakes. But in explaining this and in analyzing this, again, I show that Jamaica also illuminates much broader problem. And the problem is that in spite of our abysmal level of violence, we have a fully functioning democracy. This is quite extraordinary and challenges one of the established principles in political science, that being that democracy is inherently productive of peace. It even has a name. It's called the Democratic Peace Treatise. It's taught to students. Well, how is this possible? Jamaica's democracy is real. It's not phony. And it's ranked by almost all the international organizations that rank democracies as a free society. Not as free as Barbados, by the way, but you know, its turnout rate until recently put Americans to shame. And we have this strange system where our elections are violent, but once the votes are counted, people put down their guns and say, okay, you won. We'll wait for the next 5 years before we start again, the killings again. Makes no sense. What usually happens, you know, people continue fighting. Why are we like this? And the question which I was then led to ask, the broader question, is perhaps the democratic peace thesis wrong? Is there perhaps an inherent relationship between democracy and violence? And this is where my history comes in, because if you look at the history, you find that, in fact, they are connected. Far from being inherently peaceful, democracy does have an unfortunate association with violence. But more importantly, that the intersection of two transitions accounts for violence around the world. And the intersection of a transition to democracy, to full mature democracy, which we haven't reached yet, and the transition to a secure, workable economy. And the worst place for a country to be is at the intersection of those two transitions, which is exactly where Jamaica and several other countries are, you see. Poor countries are not violent. Haiti, the poorest country in the hemisphere, has one of the lowest rates of homicide in the hemisphere, okay? Authoritarian countries, non-democratic countries, tend to be very peaceful, okay? If you want to live in a peaceful country, you live in Franco's Spain or Pinochet's Chile. And the graph, you know, as countries move up in democracy, they tend to become more violent. And we see this in Eastern Europe right now, okay? Under Stalinism and under the Soviet regime, you had one of the most peaceful, non-violent countries in the world. Hey, you could walk out any time of the night, a woman, and so on. Very peaceful. The violence began almost on cue as soon as they started a transition to democracy. They're also the reason why this is so. And when you get the same thing with the transition towards economic development, people's expectations are increased, and they're disappointed easily, and that disappointment creates problems. People are educated, but only half educated, and they're what they expect from their education, the payoffs are not there. For all sort of reasons. Also, development always goes along with increased inequality and increased urbanization, and all of those factors induce violence. And it's only when you get to a certain point that, go beyond a certain point, that the benefits of democracy, if you like, begin to show themselves. You move towards the West European model. But you know, all the West European countries in the early stages, and America certainly was very violent. Well, it still is in part of the country quite far. But you get the point. This is where Jamaica is, along with countries such as Sri Lanka, Mexico, South Africa, and all very violent. They're at that intersection, okay? Barbados has gone beyond that. Very stable democracy, and of course, much more successful system, okay? Then you can place countries like Zambia along the grass. So that's where, however, our violence is not just due to democracy. And by the way, this is not an anti-democratic argument. I'm a fervent believer in democracy. What I want to see is that Jamaica moves along that graph towards both a more stable democracy in which our politicians, in fact, do not encourage violence, because during the electoral process, which is one of the main reasons, by the way, why democracies are violent, it tends to happen during elections, as well as develop. Whatever happens, I'd rather a democracy, even a violent one, than an authoritarian society. See, I'm happy to emphasize the fact that we are moving. We seem to have woken up from the dead economically and are moving along this path, the red path, the recent group of policies and successes. And I hope it stays in that direction. But the bad news here is that this alone doesn't explain the whole problem. I'm not going to put all the blame on democracy. Jamaica is violent because of other factors, going back to our history, that long history of resistance, okay? Of settling problems through violence, which we learned from the state. Slavery, of course, was just several centuries of violence. You learn to punish people, discipline people by violence. But the state persisted in this. Right through the colonial period, what was the most common form of punishment? The cat-o'-nine. And here is a horrible story, which I didn't realize this. I knew when I was growing up in Maypen, we'd hear sort of people, you know, got 10 lashes of the cat-o'-nine for stealing mangoes or something like that. But we continued doing this, you're not going to believe this, right up to 1999. The last person to be whipped by the cat-o'-nine by the state, yes, the people are looking startled. And it was still on the books. And it was only after the United Nations complaint, in fact, a case was brought by the last person who was whipped with the cat-o'-nine, after serving 4 years, that the UN said, what the hell is going on in Jamaica? We're going to throw you off certain critical committees, Human Rights Committee and so on, that we stopped doing it. It had become almost automatic. The state used violence to punish, okay? And that's unique to Jamaica. People learned in their relationship with each other to do that. That combated individualism, which had its good side, this is the bad side. The use of violence in settling our disputes. The use of violence in the way we bring up our children. There are many studies in that. The term murderation is the term Jamaican parents use to talk about punishing children. It's a serious problem. And I'm happy to see that just today, there's a long discussion about the child, the rights of the child, and so on, with several institutions here, UNICEF and so on. But that use of violence to settling disputes between parents and children, between men and women, is a major source. Drugs, of course, is another source. I'm proud of this table, which is this graph, which just shows this sort of drug seizures in kilograms per 100,000 people. As you'll see, Jamaica has the highest, up until Barbados is among the lowest. Drugs are less of a source now, but it was an important factor in the escalation of violence. So, in the next essay in this work, I looked at another problem. Unusual pattern of development. In an early work, the labor economist Guy Standard argued that Jamaica was unusual, again, globally, not only among post-colonial societies, but in the development of capitalism itself, in the fact that its male labor force was chronically unproletarianized, and further, that women had been brought into the labor force and proletarianized at a far greater degree than men. This would have been a very unusual situation, pattern of development, like no other country in the world. It's almost an economic law that was broken in this, because the view is that it is men who first experience the disciplining of the capitalist labor force, during which women are economically marginalized, as their traditional patterns of employment were disrupted, only much later re-entering the labor force as the economy entered a more mature stage. Now, it's that I had collected a large body of data in the course of my work for the Manley government on this. And I explored the thesis in this chapter, which is one of the most technical and data-laden, but I do urge you to read it because it has very important implications for women, for gender relations, and so on. And my findings only partly supported Standing's argument regarding the rapid incorporation of women in the labor force, but undermines the finding that men were unproletarianized or under-proletarianized. What I found is a more complex post-colonial system of labor exploitation that had deep roots again in the colonial and slave past of the island. Jamaican working class women have always faced a triple burden of hard labor in the workforce. If you look at prints of 18th century Jamaica, one thing will strike you immediately, that there were more women in the gangs than men doing the hardest work. So don't believe me, go and take a look. There, the prints are available. Because of gender prejudice, men got all the technical jobs, coopers and so on. And so the hard labor was left to women. They did the hardest work. The fact that wages are so much lower than men for the same work, even though women are usually more literate than men. Combined with sole responsibility of child rearing and very fraught gender relations, originating in the rampant rape of women and the plantation, and our learning process, the compensatory attitude of emasculated men who took out their rage and anger and a sense of social impotence in their hyper-masculine domination and beating of women. Now, this graph shows you something interesting. Women are more educated than men, but women, especially working class women, see almost little advantage in education. A completely literate woman will earn the same as a woman who is illiterate. So the returns to education are almost zero for women, at least among the working classes, maybe different among the middle class, although middle class women here may have different views on that subject. But I want to look at something else in which we are globally significant again, although in a bad sense. Take a closer look at this, our biggest shame. Now you see, this is the homicide rate. But I want to look at the blue section of each of these things, bars. What it is telling you is something you may not know. Not only we have a high homicide rate among the top 10, but Jamaica has the highest rate of female homicide in the world. Just think about that for a minute, because it's very rarely mentioned in the statistics. We concentrate on this, and it goes up and down, it goes up and down. But what has not is the fact that Jamaica has the highest rate of female homicide. Jamaica is the most dangerous place in the world for women to be. Here we are, we're topping the scores again. It's very disturbing. And I'm very happy to see the work in terms of promoting gender equity that's going on now. In the picture, the front page of the Gleaner today, I saw the men wearing heels and so on. I hope that's just not for show. I hope they really mean it. But we have a serious problem, and it's one of the major sources of our violence. Violence towards children, violence towards women. And even though the economic situation may improve, the reason why the violence rate is not going to change soon is that a lot of the violence is interpersonal violence and male-female violence. Okay? Sorry to give that bad news to you, because I don't think most of you realize this. I was shocked when I saw it as I researched this paper. But let's move to some good news now. Enough. Well, I still have some more bad news later on, but this is a reckoning I'd like to go through with you here. Now look at this. Actually, this chart brings even better news than you may have imagined with respect to our athletics prowess. You know that we have the fastest men and the fastest women in the world. But what I did here is to look at, overall, how we rank in terms of the Olympics. And I was quite shocked when I did this by my own result. What I looked at is the average number of all medals won per Olympic per million persons for selected countries. Jamaica is way up there, okay? More than 4 times greater than its closest rival, which is Russia. Far more so than America. Isn't that incredible? How can a little nation of less than 3 million people outperform the rest of the sprinting world? Every time we have Olympics, I have my Indian colleagues come up to me and scratch me and say, look, you've got 2.8 million people. We've got 1.39 billion. We don't even make the finals. What's going on in Jamaica? It's a long story. And I wish I could spend the whole lecture. In fact, I could spend several lectures on it. But I just want to emphasize several things. It's not in the genes. And I'm very disturbed by the fact that many Jamaicans seem to like this idea. In fact, when a geneticist came and decided that he was who took the genetics argument seriously, to take samples, saliva samples, the Jamaicans athletes were all lining up because they're all convinced that they're genetically superior. But, he had no problem. He had no problem whatever. This Scotsman, who was a very serious geneticist, who did a very well organized study. He took samples from Jamaica, he took samples from West Africa, the genetic source, presumably. He took samples from the running tribes of East Africa, And then he took a controlled sample of people of European origins in the United States and Europe. And of course, he went back to Scotland with his trove of DNA data and, did his analysis using the best possible methods. And the result stunned him. It was completely negative. So whenever someone comes to you with this genetic argument, just point out to them that the very best scientific work based on a scientist whose research hypothesis, that is to say, what he went into expecting, was that there were genetic factors, came out completely negative. Now, why? So the environmental and social factors had to be the right reason. There is a little side genetic argument, which I don't have the time to get into here, but that is where we're at right now. So the question is why? So my explanation is that at the start of the 20th century, a series of adventitious factors set in motion a path-dependent process, using institutional language, that culminated in the remarkable, globally unprecedented institution of champs. Champs, I cannot overemphasize as a comparative sociologist, is an unprecedented institution, world-class institution. People may think, oh, this is just athletics. It's not. It's institution building of a high caliber, equivalent to the institution building of great companies or what have you. And it was island-wide. And the history of this development is just ennobling and fascinating. And it was complemented by another important institutional development. What I mentioned earlier, are globally significant high rates of a public health campaign which took place in the 30s and 40s, which led to Jamaica having this extraordinary high life expectancy. The two movements complemented each other because for an unusual number of healthy young bodies were available for a poor country. And you add to that a converging institution development in the community development programs of the founding father, Norman Manley, who played a critical role in this. Manley was critical not only in the community development program which he established, having persuaded the United Fruit Company to give a penny for every bunch of banana, but as one of the great athletes, was very interested in integrating athletic progress with this community development. Jamaica then became unique in the history of the world, unique again. It's the only country in the world ever whose founding father was a track star. And I love, I love the point, and in fact, this point usually seals the argument when I speak in America, because I usually follow it up by saying, imagine if George Washington was a track star, and you'd get an idea of what I'm talking about. And they say, yeah, I get the idea. But also unique among countries is the fact that our national sport event, our biggest national sport event, equivalent to the Super Bowl in America, is a track event. That doesn't happen anywhere else. We're unique again. People scratch their head again when I say, you mean people come out in the thousands and to celebrate the way we celebrate Super Bowl for watching people running? To most Americans, that sounds weird. So we're unusual in this respect, once again. And the building of this island-wide institution was an extraordinary case of inter-institutional convergence, this public health system, this community development program, and this strong emphasis on inter-school athletics, all coming together to create this absolutely unique institution of championship, which we can be very proud of. It's as great as any other great institution building in any other country you can think of. So let's give them a big hand, right? All the great athletes which sort of developed this. And added to it, however, and this is a case where a negative can also be a positive. I've argued that one aspect of our culture and our social psychology is what I call is combative individualism. That partly explains our propensity to violence, but it also, I think, factors in an important place in explaining why track, why athletics. And studies of sports indicate that the most individualistic of all sports is running. You're on your own. This is not basketball. This is not soccer. You're on your own. And Jamaicans love that. And, you know, there's a striking illustration of this. When Usain Bolt, you remember that famous event in Beijing when on the point of winning he slowed down and I'm beating your butt. That is combative individualism. And anyway, that is an example of how, you know, the same institutional factor can work in different directions, okay? Now, I have an essay relating to violence and relating to a problem in explaining one event which I witnessed when I was a young lecturer here. I went to a famous cricket match. And the title of this essay is Why Did Jamaicans Riot at a Cricket Match in England? Those of you, or many of you here will be too young to remember this event. Sabina Park, 68, when the masses rioted. And my explanation was that it had to do not just the fact that the British were playing against God. We never riot against Australia or India or Pakistan. The only people who rioted against, and by the way, just so in Trinidad, just so in Guyana, but the Jamaican riot was the worst. I was there, I got tear gassed. This was serious. I described it in great length, and at great length. Partly it was the British, but more importantly, as a sociologist, when I sat down in those stands and looked at it, it was a perfect picture of Jamaica's class and color distinctions. The different stands reflected in extraordinary exactitude all the different shades. From the open stands, you know, and the bleaching sun. What? The bleachers, yes. Right. Yes, sir, right up. And in a way, I argued that in the match instance, when Butcher was given out, was the favorite of the crowd, a black player. Sobers was revered, is God, as one person said behind me, but Butcher was given out, and he was given out by a Chinese umpire. Reflecting the, okay. I won't go into more details in the way in which this cricket match and this riot reflected all the tensions in Jamaican society in 1968. And when he was given out, there was an explosion, literally. And when the police came with their riot gear and started tear gassing, I said it was like a Pirandello drama of tyranny. And so I explained it in cultural terms. And of course, besides outperforming the world in running, we're also quite extraordinary in our music. And it's not just Mali, although I have to be symbolic of this, it's global. When, near the end of the last century, Time magazine named the album Exodus by Bob Marley and the Wailers as the greatest album of the century, few aficionados of popular music were surprised. It's really quite extraordinary. 31 years later, Marley is still one of the most recognizable voices. But what is less well known is that even before reggae, Jamaican music had an outsized influence on global popular music. And you know, these things keep happening to me. I went, first of all, studying the works on music, and then this popped up, which you may not know. The first album in the history of music to sell over 1 million copies is a collection of folk songs, folk music. Not of German folk music, okay? Or of Irish folk music, which is lovely. But what was in effect a folk-inspired composition of Jamaican folk music, mento music. Harry Belafonte's album, Deo, was the very first record in the history of all music to sell over 1 million copies. And it had a profound effect on Jamaica, on America and elsewhere. It was covered by numerous singers. And you still see older Americans are still fond of that music. So even before reggae, you had this extraordinary impact. And it's important not to belittle it, as we tend to do by claiming, oh, this is just some talented people, Marley and so on. It wasn't so. As with our supremacy in running, it's a result of hard work and creative institution building. It's important to remind, because musicologists tend not to emphasize the institution building aspect of this music enough. And I guess as a sociologist, this is what I bring to its understanding. Jamaica's musical success was initiated by and largely the product of a bottom-up movement, okay? It is significant that this is also true of the more technical, this is not just people being able to sing well, of the more technical production end of the island's music industry, and it's an industry. It's an industry which employs a lot of people. The creation of an internationally competitive music industry in Jamaica with its own distinctive, globally influential, quote-unquote, recording model, to quote Ray Hitchings, who's done a fine work on this, was a complex mix of technical, creative, economic, and cultural processes. And which entail bottom-up and some top-down interaction between individuals of different classes, colors, and ethnicities, just as it with the success of the public health program. Bottom-up and top-down, different classes working together, although with major thrust came from the bottom, commanding different musical, audio engineering, and management skills, and access to funds. It's an outstanding instance of learning by doing and of adaptation, and evolutionary change, culminating in the dominant music studios of reggae greats such as, of course, Clement Sir Cox Dodd, Duke Reid, Lee Scratch Perry, King Edwards, and others. This is great institution building. Yeah? So stop thinking for a minute about the talent part of it, what Hollywood would call the talent, as opposed to the production institution building end, which became globally significant. And in explaining the global reach of reggae, I also did the same thing I did with others, the fact that it has major intellectual and theoretical and comparative significance beyond just the fact of this extraordinary development. The question I address here, and which reggae and Jamaican music answers, beautiful, is globalization leading to a homogenization of the music of the world? And in the same way that the comparison of Barbados and Jamaica sort of illustrates broader issues in the science of economic development, so it is that looking at the history of Jamaican music illustrates this important point. Now, many people have argued that there is a homogenization of the world's music. And in fact, what reggae illustrates is that this is not true. not at the working class level anyway. But because what happened in Jamaica was what seemed at first to be a classic example of the domination of American culture. Because, you know, it began by borrowing Southern rhythm and blues, and to some extent country and Western. You know, don't forget, Jamaicans tend to forget that. But country and Western was very important in Jamaica because ZQI, the only pathetic radio station we have, kept playing Perry Como and all these people. And so the only thing Jamaicans could do, they got their radios, and I grew up with this. I grew up with reggae. Was to get your radio, and you'd pick up the long wave and the short wave station. And you did get some Southern, the blues, although most of that effect was from migrants going and cutting cane. What you also got when you turn on the radio at 4 in the morning, it's just when the radio waves came in, and I'm talking from personal experience now, my mother had listened. You'd get these strange stations coming in, playing what Jamaican came to call cowboy music. And down in Maypen, and radio waves are very strange. Technicians will tell you radio waves behave in strange ways. Down in Maypen there, my mother with her radio would turn it on. And for some reason we got coming in loud and clear, Cincinnati 1, Ohio. And the Jamaicans learned, and anyway, this seemed like horrible global domination. You know, these poor people listening to country and Western music, cowboy music, and black American music. But then you know what happened. What happened is the process of glocalization, as people have called it. And Caroline Cooper and others who have, on whom I draw, and who studied this, Rupert Lewis and others have shown this principle of globalization, that people don't passively consume. And Jamaicans, with their combative individualism, it wasn't long before they're going to say, "Truman, we want something different." And they then remade it into what the rest is history. But the important thing is that this happens in all other cultures, but reggae beautifully illustrates this. And not only is there globalization, there's secondary globalization in which reggae music then went back and was profoundly influential in the rise of what became the dominant popular music in America, which is the evolution of rap music. Now, I have to be very careful when I say this to my black American audiences, because they'll chase me out of the room as a Jamaican chauvinist. But, you know, it's a fact. People like Wayne Marshall, an American, have studied this. I mean, rap is the emergence of a hybrid process of Jamaican bringing over the sound system and the various techniques of scratching and so on to the South Bronx. People like Grandmaster Flash. And then hybridizing it with traditional American rap, and out of which came rap. And that mutual interaction continues between Jamaican music and rap music, as Wayne Marshall shows in his own dissertation on the subject. And what's more, reggae now has been extremely influential in the secondary and tertiary phases of globalization, influencing African music, European music, Asian music, Japanese music, and especially Indonesian music. Again, this extraordinary little island being so astonishingly productive. So I want to end by skipping over several chapters to talk about very briefly the policy, problems of policy, because this takes us to what can be done and why we failed in this area. And let me explain, mea culpa. I was special advisor to Michael Manley for 8 years, between 1972 and 1980, for social policy and development. And I served on the island's Technical Advisory Council. Those were heady days. I worked in particular with the urban poor, which I always maintain a strong interest in. And it goes back, by the way, my interest in the poor, it goes back not just to Maypen, but to the 2 years I lived in Jones Pen, 55 Myers Street, and next door to the Ambassador Cinema, and where Bob Marley, who was about my age, used to play football on Friday nights, Friday evenings, late Friday afternoon, after which we all went to see the Triple Bill and the Ambassador Cinema, halfway through which you had Vera John's Opportunity Hour. Anyway, if you want to know where my deep interest in the poor and the Western part, so what I introduced to Manley is something which is still relevant. I strongly argued against housing schemes as a disaster. And that the approach, the policy approach, which doesn't originate with me, was urban upgrading. That is to say, you bring in better water, toilet facilities, daycare facilities, you help people rehabilitate their shacks, and so on. When you're through, you'll still have what looks like a slum, but a much better living conditions. I did research and asked people which they prefer, a housing scheme or this, and they all, over 95% said, of course they prefer this, and for good reasons. Housing schemes are a disaster. And I hope anyone here who's involved with government will understand that. It's iniquitous. Because what do you do? To understand why it's iniquitous, you have to understand the question, the answer to the question of how do people survive on under $1 a day or with zero income, which many of our people do. Have you ever puzzled over that mystery? How do you survive with zero income? The way you survive is by your network of support in your communities. The people who are working bring in money, and if they lend it, not expecting ever to have it returned, they give, and so on. They help those who are going to work by looking after their babies, and so on. It's an elaborate system of mutual aid. It's a network of support. When you move in and tear that down, you're destroying not only people's humble shacks and so on, you're destroying their livelihood. And it's iniquitous because you'll just removed 5,000, 6,000 people and replace it with what? With a couple hundred people who get these units, subsidized units. And you don't care about where the others go. Now, you know, I'm not going to call any names, or you all, if you live in this place, you'll know a perfect example of it. But politicians love it because they can point, number one, to, I did that. It's what I call the edifice complex. If you just upgrade a slum, no one's going to say, I did that, because it still looks like a slum, you see? And also, it's very effective politically because you wipe out the community and then you bring in only your supporters. It's a perfect political solution, but it's a disaster. It is the origin of the garrison system, and it's a major contributor to our violence. So I persuaded Manley initially to do this program. He liked the idea. I was able to negotiate some $15 million with AID to do this, and started it out, but I won't go into the details except to say the program eventually failed. And the reasons why this program failed illustrates everything I've said about institutions and policies and so on. So I'll just briefly tell you what happened. They failed even with the initial support of Manley, who under pressure from local leaders gave in to the demand for a housing scheme. What is more surprising were the reasons for my failure and the persons who quietly worked behind my back to undercut the program, many of them loudmouth socialist advocates of the urban poor. And I sort of developed certain lessons from this. It's a good example of the urban upgrading project. It's a good example of why nations fail, to use Ashimoglu, the title of his term, and to quote him, not the ignorance of politicians, but the incentives and constraints they face from political and economic institutions in their societies. To rephrase slightly, not ignorance of good policies, but flawed and inappropriate institutions and bad policies. The urban upgrading approach to the problem of the urban slum communities is a well-conceived program with numerous successful applications around the world. In fact, there's been a revival of this interest in directly helping the poor again. The recent winner of the Nobel Prize in economics are now back to this sort of direct approach to addressing policy rather than a more macroeconomic approach, assuming that there's going to be a trickle down, which never happens. My application is carefully thought through based on thorough research and planning involving the participation of local leaders, a survey of the views of the members, and as when asked, they said, yes, we want this program, we don't want a housing scheme. And the institution to launch a program were already there. There are many departments in the Ministry of Housing, in which it just launched, and the Ministry of Local Government. We have all kinds of institutions, the Jamaican Industrial Development Corporation, all of whom I sought their help. They would come, they'd do a walkabout, they earnestly discussed the plan and their potential contribution and left for their offices where reporters written simply repeating what they had heard from me, in addition to a few boilerplate platitudes and promises to follow up, never to be heard from again. This is a perfect example of institutional, not using the institutions which are there, incompetence. The most serious problem, however, was a lack of political will, nicely illustrating the institutional's position. The Kingston urban upgrading project did not work, mainly because the politicians involved did not want it to work, even when they were saying explicitly that they did, and were pressured by alternate demands and constraints to make decisions detrimental to the project. I've got to call names here. The Minister of Housing, Tony Spalding, wanted the project to fail, even though he went around telling the Prime Minister that he supported it. But in fact, behind my back, he went around calling it Patterson's African concept, African yard concept. And his position was that I can't tell my people that I'm going to do this urban upgrading. I've got to give them something to look forward to. They need a 2-bedroom apartment. I said, this is absurd. You can't afford it. You're going to displace thousands of people and just give a tiny number. So, well, that's your problem. Of course, he liked the idea too because he was very much into the idea of building garrisons. And so like the nation at large, that also even the leadership, who initially I mobilized, went behind my back and advocated a housing scheme. And because, of course, they were the ones who benefit. So in trying to mobilize the community, I found that I was sort of being blocked at every point. I was also blocked. I've got a story to tell you which I haven't told before. Part of our problem at that time was external destabilization of the society. And when I negotiated this project, the AID, who sponsored the project, at the end of the negotiation came up to me, we shook hands, and they said, oh, we've got a present for you. This is $50 million, a lot of money at that time. Okay, this you need an accountant, and we didn't have any accountants left in the island, or only a few. They had all gone to Miami and Toronto. So these were difficult times. Okay. But, this is the problem. You can't run a revolution without managers, and the first people to leave when you start a revolution are the managers. But that's one of the dilemmas of radical change. I can go into that agreement. But, so they said, we are going to provide you with a first-rate accountant. I said, wow, and free. Just throw it in. Great. We welcome this. He said, a black American guy, very competent and so on, who was my accountant. It was there when things were getting really heated up, late in the 70s. A renegade CIA agent decided to spill the beans on CIA agents who were planted around the world. And one day, my phone started ringing off the hook. I answered it. He said, Orlando, you don't hear the news. Your accountant is one of the men the CIA agent mentioned as being planted. This is an aside, sorry. I mean, okay, so finally, ladies and gentlemen, you've been very patient, but I want to mention one of the most difficult experiences I've had to write about, which I finally came to write about here. My relationship with Michael Manley. And this, by the way, this is a picture of me and Michael was introducing the urban upgrading project. I said, that's me with my pipe there. I used to smoke a pipe. And anyway, I shall discuss for the first and I think the last time in one of the chapters. I had met him when I was an undergraduate, when he came to UWI, right here with his father, and we stayed in touch. And he encouraged me to come back to give up my position on the London School of Economics, which I did, and I was very much involved with him in opposition, help him prepare his speeches, and so on. It was an interesting relationship, but then after the Rodney affair, I despaired that there'd ever be any. I saw Jamaica going in the wrong direction. I was held up at gunpoint by soldiers right outside here as I tried to go home, but in response to the Rodney thing. You were there. Well, I lived on university clothes and I was trying to. Anyway, I left. But I came back in the 70s, halfway, spent about 5 months of the year there. Now, the program we advocated was not communism. It was not even democrat. There's nothing, socialism was a misnomer. It was social democracy along British Labour Party lines. Manley was not a communist, certainly. He was not even a socialist. Our failures were largely self-inflicted. Try to move too far, too fast. And the problems were not lack of funds, but a lack of institutional competence in executing the millions of programs. And as I said, the lack of managerial talent. The lesson I learned to repeat is that you can't run a revolution without managers. And when the managers all have US visas and bank accounts, in this respect, we're different from Taiwan. The Taiwanese, they don't speak the language, it's too far, they don't have contacts. Our entire middle class is very embedded in America. That makes radicalism difficult. But the movement's biggest problem may have been Manley himself. Okay, this fellow, take a good look. The charismatic leader par excellence. It was a sight to behold him holding a crowd in spellbound rapture and adulation. You had to see it to believe it and hear it. And yet, he could be quite distant in personal interactions unless he was making an effort to charm you to his point of view, which he was very good at. Not just women, but he loved the people. But off the stage, he was rarely at ease with ordinary people. Rather shy. He was at heart an intellectual. My most animated discussions with him were about ideas rather than the details of the many policies I was involved with. Not just urban upgrading, I was involved with community councils and so on. His public life was one of utmost propriety, honesty, and integrity. And unlike nearly every third world leader of his day and now, he, like his father, left office with less money than he entered. In fact, I've discussed it many times with Rachel, who's a friend. He was nearly broke. I knew he was, okay? A man of great integrity in public life. But his private life was one of ruthless selfishness and sexual corruption. With the exception of two of his 5 wives, the beautiful one, and she was very beautiful. One of my most memorable evenings was having dinner with him and her. So the beautiful one who died young in his arms, and the other older one in whose arms he died. He broke the heart of nearly every one of the many wives and lovers who succumbed to his irresistible charms. And that, alas, was equally true of his daughters. And you really should read Rachel Manley's extremely moving, evocative portrait of him in his dying days, Slipstream, a masterpiece memoir. In fact, this chapter was written originally as a foreword to that book, which she honored me by asking me to write. I was so perplexed by Manley that I have never been able to write directly about him. And it wasn't until Rachel asked me to write the foreword that I was able to do so. In the wake of the hauntingly beautiful prose that carried her memoirs, or memories of life in the ebbing slipstream of her father. I did not have much to add to her revelations, really, but what little I did is about all I ever wish to say about him. However, I don't want to end, and my book did not, on a pessimistic note, and I therefore want to conclude by briefly asking what were the factors accounting for our global successes? Are these things they have in common? They're things that we can learn from in fixing our many problems? There's a remarkable global health program or success there. And it's worth noting, the historical demographer James Riley found that the most important factor explaining this health revolution was the cooperation, participation, and resilience of the Jamaican people, who energetically engaged once they realized it was in their own benefit. I quote him. This is an American demographer. Among the people the British regarded as willful and disobedient. By the way, when the people came in to do this program, the governor and the colonial office said, "You're crazy, these Jamaicans are a disobedient and riotous lot. You're wasting your time." And this is what he wrote. Among the people the British regarded as willful and disobedient, the essential steps were taken by self-reliant Jamaicans who decided to become better informed about hygiene and health and to have their children learn about these things, who agreed to build latrines with locally available materials, and who cooperated with the new public health authorities and modified their own behavior in many ways. Can you believe he's talking about Jamaicans? They were doing this in the 30s and 40s. One basic principle that informed the campaign was the interaction of top-down with bottom-up leadership. Another important reason for the success of the program was that it was a classic case of participants learning by doing. And the people who run our educational program, I want you to listen to this. As the great economist, the Nobel laureate winner, Kenneth Arrow, pointed out long ago, quote, "Learning is a product of experience. Not something you hammer down in people's head at school and then send them off into the world. Learning can only take place through the attempt to solve a problem, and therefore only takes place during activity," unquote. The leadership of the public health movement mobilized a large number of modestly educated Black Jamaicans, low-level clerks, parochial workers, agricultural field officers, pupil teachers, practical nurses, small farmers to educate the masses. By this means, they learned by doing public health management and were eventually in a position to lead and educate others to work towards the better health of their own. Then there's much that Jamaican leaders today can learn from this isolated ground-level success from the colonial past. Writing recently on institutional learning and change, a group of development researchers at a Dutch research center, and we can learn a lot from Holland, by the way, set out a framework for successful development practice that includes the following: the importance of partnership and grassroots participation, what others have described as top-down, bottom-up learning, the expansion of the role of teacher and supervisor to those of facilitator and coach, the reconception of desired outcomes from too rigidly defined objectives to a focus on processes and capabilities, the treatment of failure as a valued learning opportunity, not something to sulk about, and seeing change in evolutionary and adaptive rather than prescriptive and predetermined terms. And we find in one form or another similar principles at play in the development of Jamaica's other successes. Our free press, which is another of our successes, so recently cited as the 6th freest in the world, much freer than America's, which is now being threatened by the person in the White House, also illustrates these points. One striking exception to the extractive institutional structures and racial exclusiveness of the colonial era was, for example, the Gleaner newspaper, established by 2 Jewish half-brothers in 1834, some 17 years before the New York Times. It trained generations of mainly self-educated journalists who learn by doing. And in 1951 took the historic step of elevating a black journalist, Theodore Seeley, as its editor. That had a profound effect on many Jamaicans, certainly on me. In contrast to the virtual lockout of the majority of the population from managerial position at that time. For most Jamaicans, the Gleaner and its tabloid evening paper, The Star, and more recently, The Observer, books was the main reading matter. As a child, I've got to mention, my own vocabulary greatly expanded by reading the Gleaner. Now, you're told, educators told you the way to encourage your child to learn is to read to your child. My mother went one step further. As soon as I learned to read, and she was sitting by a sewing machine, I'd have to read to her. Worked wonders. My vocabulary expanded phenomenally, and I learned by reading the Gleaner to her. Sometimes we're often too poor to buy the daily edition, so we'd get the edition the day before. And the Gleaner, along with its first-rate competitor, the left-leaning, the Jamaica Observer, and a large number of radio stations are cornerstones of American free press and lively civic culture, okay? Finally, in this little island of endless surprises, there are some new and encouraging signs of hope. In recent years, a new generation of young, smart, highly educated, and principled leaders have been replacing the post-colonial politicians and businessmen that have made such a mess of the island's development. They include, in particular, our former Minister of Finance, give him his due, Peter Phillips, now head of the opposition, Nigel Clark, a Rhodes Scholar, mathematician, and our young Prime Minister, as well as many executives in the private sector, and a newly found sense of common good, and have achieved considerable changes, as you know. I don't have to spell them out, Jamaica being sort of Bloomberg declaring the island's little stock market the best performing, and Jamaica is now ranked the best place to do business in the Caribbean. Is that really true? I don't know. So, among the best in the world to start a business. According to Global Banking and Finance, I can only go by the data. I'm a data-driven person. An important element of this striking turnaround was the revival and extension of the once moribund social partnership program, which solved one of the biggest problems of development, the problem of coordination between the different classes. And it's a remarkable example of a turnaround. There's still a great deal to be done, and the downside risks are high, including those from natural disasters, which we have to take seriously, that are on the decrease due to global warming. And it is questionable whether the hungry, angry, and violent urban poor are willing to give them the time they need, in spite of these remarkable improvements. However, they can take heart, and hope from the long-suffering rural population. So, for all of us, but especially we Jamaicans, history is the uterine force that shapes us. History is not some memory which we look back at from a distant armchair. When we view our past, what we see is our own time and moment embedded in the process of becoming. And if we look deeply enough, we soon realize that our moment is nothing more than what the great philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine called a time slice in a continuous identity, just like a river, whose identity can never be that which we see beneath us from the moment's bank, but the entirety, the spatio-temporal being, which springs from source to ocean, from its beginning to the last droplet at its end, whatever that may be. For better or worse, we live our past. But history is not destiny, my friends. We also live and make our future. If Jamaica's turbulent, confounding past and present teaches us anything, it is that we can seize and take advantage of the hand that history has delivered us and shape the future that we want. Our enormous successes, globally competitive successes, make that clear. So have the recent changes in our economic fortunes. So let us learn from our successes and our failures and make the future we all so ardently desire. Thank you.
Sitting down. There's no such thing as being too long. When the content is so riveting, nobody left the room. Not for the bathroom, not for water, nobody left. Okay, there is a mic set up, and we're inviting people who want to ask questions to use the mic, because we are taping this for posterity, and we're also streaming it live. I would ask only that resist the temptation to present a second lecture and confine yourself to asking a question. The mic is set up, and since you're all so shy, I will abuse the privilege of the chair and ask the first question until you get to the mic, which is it that Jamaicans have an ego-focused sense of development, that individually they can make it, but collectively they cannot make it?
No, I don't think so. In fact, the successful cases I gave was indeed a case of cooperation. All the successes were not both cooperation, bottom up and top down, cooperation in terms of people learning and passing on what they learn to others. This is clear in the public health revolution, but it's the same thing in our music. It is an extraordinary case of cooperation. People learn these rather complicated engineering skills. These are people who are barely literate. I mean, do you know how running a studio, how complicated it is? And learning and passing it on. The same goes to, if you look at our athletic successes, in which you have, again, extraordinary cooperation at all different levels. You know, read the biography of Usain Bolt. And I love to mention this to Americans. How did Jamaicans discover the talent of this extraordinary young man? In almost any other country, the talent would not have been discovered, because Bolt was way in the bush. Went to a little school which didn't even have a playing field big enough for or even half the size of a standard track. And what's more, his first love was not running, it was cricket. And what you found here is a remarkable case of his talent being recognized by someone, a peasant too, and fellow peasant, his father, and then encouraged the boy. The boy would not respond. Went to his father, little response. Then he found from the father that he loved his chicken, and he was bribed virtually by this. No, so you had, and then of course people came together. It's a remarkable case of, a village producing his talent, and in fact moving him away from his first love, which is cricket, which he really, so no, and as I said in the public health example I gave, in the coaching of people, the reverence which people have for coaching, the respect, the mutual respect you see between the coaches and the athletes. And then many, we go on YouTube, you'll see many cases of this. This is cases of people coming together and working together. Even though and exploiting in a way that combative individualism. So the two can go together. They aren't necessarily in opposition.
I'd like to recognize that we have been joined by the Minister of Finance and Planning. This is by public request, Minister. I've been admonished several times for my major faux pas not recognizing you, so I now correct that. So welcome, and I don't know, in the absence of further questions, if you want to respond to Professor Patterson's comment about...
No, I don't. No, I don't. I should point out that the minister is a friend of mine, and I've got to defend him here. I mean, I want to put him in a very tricky situation. But...
Okay, I'm Blossom Amelia Nelson. I actually was in some of your lectures, Professor, you might not remember. I don't think I had that name at that time anyway. I have a very stunning and riveting presentation, and we expect nothing less. And I'm also happy that there's a book outside there that I could afford and that I actually bought it. Thank you for giving us at a reasonable price. Having spanned several decades, and I mean several decades of contribution to this country, I'm concerned at this point in time, and I'd like your comment on it. I deal with young people still, but I'm not finding that sense of nationalism. I'm not finding a set of people that are really engaged in what is national identity. Having been brought up on Caribbean identity and Jamaican this and I'm Barney and Yard and this and that, I am completely confused as to how these young people can be so disconnected from anything really that speaks to nationalism and selfhood and the development of a nation. I don't know if you sense any of that. Could you just comment on it? Only for my good health, I'd appreciate if you gave me some hope in that direction.
I'm not as pessimistic as you are in that regard. In fact, my sense is that Jamaicans are among the most nationalistic people around. I mean, they do, it is quite extraordinary. And in fact, you tend to see this abroad. In fact, Jamaicans are quite notorious abroad for boasting about their country. And so I must disagree. I mean, they're angry, they're unemployed, and they're disappointed in life and so on, but you shouldn't confuse the anger with not loving the nation. And as a comparative sociology looks at many other countries, the commitment to the country is very strong. And as I said, the commitment to the democracy is very strong, and to the state. So what has happened, though, is that Jamaicans, as you know, have one of the highest rates of the diaspora communities, I mean, of migration. We have one of the highest rates of out-migration in the world. This has not lessened. In fact, when people go abroad, they become even more nationalistic. But what has emerged is what we call a transnational community, a transnational space in which Jamaicans are very prominent and live in both communities. And when people are in Brooklyn, they are in Jamaica. You smell the curry, you sort of hear the music, and so on. So the national space has been expanded to include this important basis of survival, the transnational community. Because as you know, our economy depends on foreign earnings, and the greatest net contributor on our foreign earnings is our remittances from these very committed Jamaicans. So disappointment about their economic situation, yes, but it shouldn't be confused with lack of commitment to the state. I can assure you that comparatively, we're among the most nationalistic of peoples. I don't think that's a problem myself. Yes, yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Patterson, I should say, welcome back. My name is William Campbell. I was in your class in 1969. I think it's good that we can look back on 50 years, you know.
Are you trying to tell him I'm an old man?
No,
That's okay.
okay.
Wisdom comes with age, so thanks.
Certainly. Two things. One is an observation. It has to do with the, how should I say, our confoundedness.
Yes.
I read your book, Slave and Social Death, and I came across the fact that you were saying that the Jamaican slave woman, it was the first record in history of slavery of women who went into gynecological revolt. They refused to have children. And I found that very interesting.
Yes.
I'm rereading your work, and tell me if I found a fairly significant shift in your conception of freedom in Sociology of Slavery and in your book on freedom. And I find it difficult to reconcile that conception in Sociology of Slavery and in freedom.
What exactly do you find? Because, you know, as the chair pointed out very kindly, my thought evolved starting with my work on Jamaica. But so I'm interested in what you found
in
problematic that development.
Sociology of Slavery, the perplexing question was, how do we explain the persistence of rebellion?
Yeah.
And you have said it strictly speaking, it lies outside of the framework of the sociologists. The essential thing was the freedom embedded in the human soul, which causes even the most tractable slave to rebel. But in freedom, I think you're saying that view, in fact you call it strange,
Right.
you sort of castigate that view. And
Yeah.
how do you reconcile those two views?
Yeah,
It is sort of academic, but in reviewing the works, you know, one would want to know if I am onto something.
I get you. Yeah,
You see?
that's a very, very good point. That's a very good observation. No, that's a very good observation.
Because the second view lays the foundation of, you were saying that the Greeks invented freedom.
Sure, yeah, but you made your point, and yes, no, you're absolutely right. In the Sociology of Slavery, remember, I wrote in my early 20s, and it did, at that time, I was committed to the then and still widely accepted view that freedom is inherent, that, as Locke said, is written in the heart of man and woman. I think myself that that's not, I later came to the view that that was not correct. So one evolves, by the way, you know, what do you think when you're in your 20s? You may not think the same 20 years later as you read the history of slavery. I'd only studied then the history of Jamaica and the Jamaican slaves' position. The position I later came to was that no, freedom is not inherent. And in fact, it's a dangerous idea. Because if you think, as Locke did, that it's written in the heart of men, he didn't say women, but I presumably think he meant that too, you will do reckless things. Like, to give the most reckless example, America decided that freedom is written in the heart of Iraqi. And that all you have to do is to go in blazing with those guns, and the Iraqis would all rise up because freedom is written in their hearts and thank you and so on. No, it didn't happen. And there are many cases of, actually I learned later on, of people who have other ideals, other values which they treasure more. Love of God, love of honor, militarism, nirvana, what have you. And that indeed, freedom as a value is socially constructed. But where it's consistent with the earlier work is that how did it, so the question then becomes one which philosophers never ask, because philosophers are firmly committed to the view that is written in the heart of people, and therefore all you have to do is just sit in your armchair and speculate about what it might be, like Sir Isaiah Berlin or whatever. And my argument then, what evolved from my research was that there are too many countries where that is not the case. A lot of people do not. In fact, in many cultures, there's not even a word for freedom. And an interesting thing I did, where being at Harvard, you have students from many societies and cultures. And one of the things I did in writing freedom is I got my Chinese, Korean, and Japanese students, as well as several Asian students, to do etymology of the words, what the original literal meaning is of the words. Now, one of the things discovered is that there was not in the traditional vocabulary a word for freedom in many languages. They didn't see the need for it. Now, all languages will now have a word for freedom, but that often comes under pressure from the West. And I imagine a situation in which a missionary, having spent all his life and now converting 2 or 3 people in a foreign culture, decided before he goes home, he's going to write a dictionary. And a lot of dictionaries involve in that. And imagine a conversation in which you say, well, what's your word in country X for freedom? What's that? We don't have such a word. And the missionary would say, yes, you must have a word. He didn't say it's written in your heart. And the person will say, well, you tell me what you think it is, and I'll try to find the word for it. And it's explained. And then they say, aha. And they'll come up with a word, and very often, in almost every language, the word means something like, something disgusting. Or disobedience. That's true of the word which evolves in China, in Japan in particular. If you go to the literal meaning, it's not so now, you get a meaning given which is derogatory. That is, so the fact that all people have a word for freedom now comes down to Western pressure. In fact, most cultures, many cultures in Asia and so on, did not have the word. They didn't see the need for it because they had other ideals. So in a nutshell, if you think it's written in the hearts of people and hear it, you don't ask the obvious question, which is, how did it come about? And once I decided that it's not true, as I assumed when I was writing Sociology of Slavery as a young person, that it's inherent, then the interesting research question arises, which nobody else has asked before, which presumably is why the book won the National Book Award, which is, so how did it come about? Okay, how was it socially constructed? And then I went back to slavery then. And the paradoxical thesis is that it arose in antithesis to slave society, which is a very unusual development in the history of the world. Not slavery. Slavery is widespread, but slave society, in which you have large-scale slavery, is unusual. And it first emerged in ancient Greece. Though I found myself in a weird situation here, because as a sociologist, as a young man, my response is, the view that slavery was originally Western, I would attack as Western imperialist nonsense. But it was quite clear after this that the word evolved out of the experience of large-scale slavery in ancient Greece, the first such society in the history of the world. And I'm willing to grant that because it's not a very flattering view of how slavery, how freedom evolved. But then it became central to Western thought that the most significant value in the civilization evolved, if you like, in contrast to, dialectically, to use a fancy term, with slavery. And as slavery continued to be significant in the West, in fact, it's the thesis of the late David Bryan Davis, which I've developed. So it's a complex story. It's not one which is essentially flattering to the West, but so I'm willing to grant the West that they invented the idea. But they're not happy with my explanation of how they came to invent the idea. And my work on slavery, of course, which followed on David Bryan Davis's work, is the centrality of slavery in Western civilization. We're kind of straying in my other areas now from Jamaica, but that in no other civilization was slavery so critical that at all the high points in Western culture and civilization, slavery reared its ugly head, including the rise of capitalism. There is now, among my colleagues and friends at Harvard, a major new historical development that slavery, including Jamaican slavery, to bring back the story here, was not incidental to the rise of capitalism, but was a critical factor in the rise of capitalism. And Jamaican slavery, of course, was a profound, important one. And one of the great West Indians who started this, of course, was Eric Williams, who is one of my heroes. How are you?
Good night, sir, ladies
beautiful
and gentlemen. My name is Johan Simpson. Sir, thank you so much for your very enlightening presentation tonight.
Yes, sir.
We have the propensity to be an extremely violent people. And whilst there is always going to be the need for long-term intervention and change, there has to be something done in the short term. Mm-hmm. Now, whilst I know that we're doing quite a few things, I'm interested to hear your opinion on what can, or should be considered as possible short-term interventions, whether we should point them mainly along the lines of intervention and deterrence or prevention and change. So I'm very interested in hearing your opinion on that, sir.
Well, first of all, you have to do both. But secondly, let me say that there's been a lot of excellent work on crime in Jamaica. We've got hundreds of studies, and I drew heavily on these works, made it quite clear my debt to all these studies. So we have no shortage of the solutions and the policies that should be followed. I mean, the research is stellar, first rate, okay? And I can't improve on them. I mean, I can only refer you to my chapter, and in which I cited at least 35 sources, including many works done by scholars here. But this is another case where we know the policies and implementing them, the implementation deficit, which the Germans ventured in the session of Jamaica. It seems to be the case. It's a perfect example. We don't have no shortage of policies. And we also have the institution, the police force, and so on. But if you look again at the police force, the institutional competence, what we inherited from, to go back, I mentioned this, from the colonial period was just so strikingly in contrast to what, say, the Barbadians invented, with the police force being, in fact, from right after slavery established, superintendents and so on in the police. So as late as the late colonial period, and my father was a policeman and so on, nobody rose above, very few people rose above the ranks of sergeant. And my father never rose beyond the ranks. He made the detective rank, but he never rose beyond the rank of lance corporal, even though he was a very smart man. And I have a little story I have to tell you about, a side story, forgive me. But When Marcus Garvey was kicked out of America and sent back to Jamaica, the colonial office here went into a panic. And they wanted to do everything to get him on a treason charge. So they looked around and they had to find a black detective to tail him. And they needed one who had good shorthand. And my father had perfect Pitman shorthand and was a detective. And he was selected to tail Garvey. And so the best record of Garvey's speeches were written by my father. If you go to the Jamaican, Records Office, they're in my father's handwriting as he transcribed his Pitman shorthand on Garvey's speeches there. But the story doesn't end there. In the course of covering and tailing Garvey, he became a Garveyite. They never forgave him, so he never rose beyond the rank of Lance Corporal. So to answer your question, it's having those core competencies. But number one, the fact that we started way behind in our police force, which just didn't have the command structure when we inherited the force. And Professor Mills, years ago, did a wonderful study on the Jamaican civil service and the fact that one of the biggest disadvantages is that the command structure was entirely British. And we never learned that core competence. And we are the institution of the police force, but as we do now, so we have to just become more competent in implementing these wonderful policies. But having said all of that, part of the problem too is it's not just this, it's not just poverty. I'm afraid it's become culturally self-reinforcing violence. It's rooted in gender relations, it's rooted in child rearing practices, and it's rooted in the fact that, we resolve our problems in violent terms, personal. So a lot of the crime now is no longer due to cocaine and drug trafficking. It's not even due to economic factors. It's due to personal factors, and that's going to take a long time to solve. And it involves really fundamental changes in how we bring up our kids. And the schools are going to be important, I'm afraid, as well as parents in this. So I'm afraid that's my pessimistic response, okay? Yes, sir.
Hi. Good evening. I read your book and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Question: how do we, Lipton Matthews, how do we get Jamaicans to acknowledge that not all aspects of culture are worth preserving? Yes. Big question.
Oh, okay. Now, if you read I've written a lot in the theoretical works on culture, and one of the points I make about culture is that I don't like the big term culture. I tend to think of cultural configurations. That in a modern complex society like Jamaica, and we are complicated, culture, what we have are cultures. There are at least 3 major configurations of culture in Jamaica. There's a rural peasant-based culture, which is not a violent one, which is very rich, which is a source of, Bob Marley learned a lot from 9 Mile, where he grew up way in the St. Ann bush. That's one. We have the urban culture with its strong emphasis on honor, and which has been studied by many people. And we have the culture of the Anglo-Jamaican elite. So I can't answer the question because, okay, I can. There are certain if you ask me, the urban proletarian culture has much that needs to be changed. The violence is quite endemic. But note, it's from this culture that some of the most powerful, positive things have come. The music is rooted in that culture. Okay, it's also partly in the rural areas. So I can't make a blanket statement about removing one culture as opposed to the other. What we have to do is recognize that there are problems in all of them. There are problems in the elite culture. I don't want to offend people now, so I'm not going to go into that right here, right? Because most no. Got it. There are even problems in the peasant culture, you know. You shouldn't idolize it too much. It has its problems, although it's a beautiful culture. And I ended my book with a quote, you know, from which I forgot to show you. An old, okay, and it's a very wise culture. It means a lot. That's a very powerful statement, by the way. But it has its problems too. Some of its trial rearing practices are not very good. I mean, I remember going and spending time down in Lagovia with my country, small farm, uncle, and being beaten quite savagely by my grandfather down there. I mean, the use of the whip is just still, I mean, that was, you know, I must have backtalked, you know, so I come from Maypen, and he was horrified that I backtalked him. Before I know, he had a tamarind switch and was beating the hell out of me. So there are issues in all the cultures. So we have to think about what we remove and so on, okay?
Okay, I know what I would like to remove though.
I'd like to hear what you would like to remove.
So, immediate gratification, materialism, gangsterism, bandulism, which is actually the undermining of a legitimate rules-based order, and promiscuity, and intellectual myopia.
Oh, well, I mean, you have a future. Yes, sir. Now you carry on. So, I think we've exhausted our questionnaires. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Just to wind up the program very quickly, would Mr. Ian Randall come to the front and present a book to a representative of the University of the West Indies Library, Miss Genevieve Jones Edmond. Ian?
If you notice, I'm on the program. I don't know how I got there, but since I'm there, I'll just say a few words, which in my own words to welcome and to thank Professor Patterson. I am, unlike my friend Pinchy, I didn't have the good fortune of being taught by Professor Patterson, but I have vivid memories of him walking across the campus, smoking his pipe, dressed in complete white and wearing sandals. Am I right? So when the opportunity came, and it came quite accidentally, I interviewed Professor Patterson back in May, June this year. And we talked about some of the subjects in this book. And when the opportunity came to license an edition to be published in Jamaica by Ian Randall Publishers, to make it accessible price-wise in Jamaica, it's been one of my proud moments. Thank you very much. I just had one comment which I made elsewhere, which is to say about the title. I'm glad you used the word confounding and not confounded, which would have made a big difference.
The final thing is to ask a representative from the Department of Sociology, Dr. Laura Obermuller, to give the vote of thanks, after which you are invited to join the author at a reception downstairs. But I would prefer if, when you come to the reception, you bring along the book that you had purchased. The highest compliment that you can pay to a scholar is to purchase the book and read it.
You should get involved in marketing. Honorable Minister of Finance and Planning, Mr. Nigel Clark, former Governor General, Sir Kenneth Hall and Lady Hall, members of the diplomatic community, Head of the Department of Sociology, Psychology and Social Work, Dr. Overall Taylor, colleagues from my department, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I wish to thank my colleague, Dr. Michael Barnett, to my right. Stand up, Michael. For reaching out to Professor Patterson and inviting him to join us this evening, but more importantly, to being the key organizer for tonight's event. In terms of organizing, I also need to thank the Vice Chancellor Secretariat and also the Pro Vice Chancellor Secretariat, in addition to the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work. Further, I wish to thank the publishing company, Ian Randall, for also making the books available at a reduced cost this evening. So to add to the marketing promotion, if you purchase a copy tonight, it is literally $500 less than a university bookshop. I know this, I purchased one yesterday, and I realized tonight I should have purchased it instead because it's cheaper. I also wish to thank those who provided financial support in addition to the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work. I wish to thank JMMB, Joan Duncan Foundation, and Chase Foundation.